Good morning, everyone. My name is Juyun Chang, and I'm the director of the Child Wellbeing Program at the Doris Duke Foundation. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm so grateful to Aspen for organizing this important conversation about moving from a child welfare system to a prevention-oriented child wellbeing system. At Doris Duke, we believe that all children deserve the opportunity to thrive. And we know that children thrive when they are safe with their families and in supportive communities. We also recognize that all families need help sometimes, and help should come from those who understand, respect, and love families, their own communities. The child welfare system we have created is simply not designed to support most families in this way. It's not a critique of the people who work in the current system, rather, is a design flaw that has been decades in the making. The current child protection system has been designed based on a set of false beliefs, supported through a set of problematic policies that promoted practices that has over time resulted in a surveillance driven, deficit based system that overly relies on foster care. We must challenge false beliefs that child welfare agencies must rescue unsafe children through family separation from bad parents, often defined as such because of their race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. We must also challenge the belief that keeping children safe and well is the responsibility of one agency. And we must change policies and practices that refuse to see or help families until their challenges become crisis. The good news is that we have started to make significant changes in federal policy with passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act. We now have a federal guarantee for prevention services, and states can define for themselves those who are eligible for preventive interventions. And a few bold, innovative leaders have done so expansively. In addition, states must oversee the safety of children receiving services, but can do so without involving children and families in the traditional foster care system with its traditional rules of surveillance, and a few bold, innovative leaders have done so. As a result, some jurisdictions are demonstrating how to build a multi-dimensional child well-being system for families who we know are at risk of foster care without waiting for children to experience harm compounded by the trauma of family separation. But as incredible as FFPSA is, and as important as it is for us to work with jurisdictions to maximize this new policy, there's more work to be done. In particular, we must examine definitions of maltreatment that conflate poverty with neglect. Nearly half of all state definitions of maltreatment do not exclude a parent's inability to financially provide for a child. This must change. Poverty is not neglect. Poverty can make it difficult for parents to meet some of their child's needs, but it doesn't mean that they don't love or care for their child. But changes in definition aren't enough. Our new prevention systems must include concrete supports that address all family needs, including material needs. Communities demand, and Doris Duke is committed to helping build a prevention oriented child well-being system to help address the complex needs that families face, including material need and social isolation, in a way that is free of racism and bias and that promotes equity and justice. Our goal is not merely to improve the current child welfare system, but rather to help create a new system that is based on family and community strengths and focused on promoting child well-being, as opposed to merely intervening in abject abuse. DDF will focus on two key strategies to accelerate progress in creating this new prevention-oriented child well-being system. One is to support, pilot, and demonstrate a fundamentally new systematic approach to child abuse and neglect prevention that is centered on a community pathway to help. And two, by supporting policy interventions that alleviate family poverty, a uniquely significant risk factor in child abuse and neglect. I want to conclude by thanking Katie Albright and Myra Jones-Taylor for co-chairing, and Deidre Henry Spires for facilitating, and each and every member of the 2Gen Prenatal to 3 Learning and Action community for their work that contributed to what is the foundation for this conversation.
Good morning. It's wonderful to see everyone here today. Is this not working? Hi there. It's great to see everyone here today. What a wonderful, wonderful morning. We are going to start with a little bit of a trauma-informed check-in, expressing some gratitude. But before we get there, I am thrilled and honored to be joined on the stage by Asia E. Schoenberg, Associate Commissioner of the U.S. Department of Children's Bureau, Administration for Children and Families, as well as a 2021 Ascend Fellow. Exactly. Christine Norbert Beyer, Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Children and Families. Leah Austin, the President and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute in Georgia. And finally, Randall Baylor, the program lead for the Community Engagement and of the Early Childhood Innovations Network, as well as a parent representative, and join me on the Learning and Action Committee that we'll be talking a little bit more about. As was introduced, I'm Katie Albright. I'm with Safe and Sound. We're a community-based organization in San Francisco, working every day to strengthen families and end child abuse, neglect, and trauma. We start our work every day in meetings and in collaboration in community, very often trying to practice trauma-informed systems, trauma-informed practice. And so I thought I'd bring a little bit of that here today. The first is just ground yourself. Put your legs down. We'll do a breathing, just, a couple quick breaths to come in the room. Close your eyes if that feels comfortable to you. Thank you. The second practice is about gratitude. And there is so much to be grateful for, and sometimes often hard to see the gratitude. So I'd love if you could take just a moment and think about what you are grateful for, and turn to your neighbor next to you. And if you're online, maybe write it down or think about it on a piece of paper. Just one thing that you're grateful for in your life. And then we'll start our conversation. Thanks for being here. Thank you. Thank you so much. Aspen and Ascend is all about relationships. And so it's oftentimes nice to see who you are sitting next to. Absolutely. So thank you. I am super grateful myself, not only for my incredible panelists, I'm honored to be with you today. I'm also grateful to Ju, who introduced us, and the Doris Duke Foundation for their vision, their leadership, and always thinking about family and child well-being. Ascend and the Doris Duke Foundation were part of this, as Ju talked about, this 2-generation prenatal to 3 learning and action committee. We have recently issued a report. You'll find the postcard on your seat, and I hope you go to that QR code and download it. I wanted to share a little bit about that report just as a framing of our conversation today. The Learning and Action Committee came together virtually in January of 2021 We set out this path to reimagine the child welfare field and our approach to child protection to reflect prevention and a strength-based whole family orientation, drawing on the provisions of the Federal Family First Prevention Services Act, as well as thinking about state, local, and tribal innovation. The report was just released, and I have a deep amount of gratitude to Ascend colleague James White for making this report happen. Thank you, James, and bringing us all together. I'm also super grateful for my co-chair, Myra Jones-Taylor, and my co-facilitator, Deidre Henry Spires. And most importantly, I want to thank the parent leaders who are part of the Action Committee, who really guided, led us, and really advised us on how we think about this work going forward. We tried to listen deeply, and I wanted to share just a few learnings as well as just a brief overview of our recommendations, and then we'll get into conversation. We heard at an individual level that families are seeking food. Kristen talked about this yesterday, about the father who's helping to care for their child and his own stomach is rumbling, about housing, healthcare, the need for mental health, the need for childcare, that is half of us, right? Valerie talked about childcare as half of us, the importance of mental health. And I think Christian also said this yesterday, that he's made a decision, or families have made a decision to chase wellness as opposed to their economic success. So how do we do both of those? How do we not make that choice? And families, we learned in our learning committee that families are both grappling and balancing joy in their life as well as crisis. Maybe that is part of the human condition that Matt talked about. We also heard in our Learning Action Committee about solutions at an individual level, as well as at a community level. How do we change conditions in communities to strengthen and support families, build those protective factors? And how do we think about systems change, reimagining or dismantling systems that are systemically oppressive? So the Learning and Action Committee came up with 4 recommendations, and I know you'll read the report and learn more about them, but just at a high level, we talked about centering equity and prioritizing prevention, really for outcomes, improved outcomes for families, like 2-generation outcomes for families. Oftentimes, our child protection system is focused on outcomes for children, as they should. What would it look like if the protection system focused on outcomes for families? The report mentions innovation like family resource centers, home visiting models, and other protective factor building models, changing the definitions of neglect, as Ju spoke about. The report, that was the first recommendation. The second recommendation is about ensuring that both child welfare system and the larger system of care of education is culturally congruent and responsive. The third recommendation is about investing in workforce, and I know we'll spend time talking about that today with our panelists, and we heard about that yesterday. And the final recommendation is about considering the potential and impact of leveraging existing and new funding. And Marjorie spoke a little bit about that this morning, and that's certainly a hallmark of Aspen Ascend, is thinking about leveraging funding. So with that, I would love to be able to introduce the panel and have our thoughtful discussion. In creating these questions, I realize I'm inspired by Janine's statement, don't meet parents where they are, meet parents where they dream. And so we're going to be spending a little bit of time today talking about our own dreams. But let me talk first about what keeps you up at night. Randall, you work locally, you support parents and fathers in particular. If you could start with what keeps you up at night when you think of the current state of affairs of our nation's children and families.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone. What comes to mind for me is that when you think about opportunities that families are missing or don't have information about, when you think about families that could have gotten connected to a service or a resource that was not connected to that resource, And then when you understand how those issues compound families, it leaves a sort of say a dent in you when it's almost like you want to work 25/8. You don't want to tell a family no. And then one of the bigger issues is that when you're good at something or good at helping people, that the need grows. So as the need grows and understanding that you're just one person, but still trying to find ways that maybe you can duplicate your efforts through others, or as my job always says, try to clone myself. It comes up with, it keeps you up with just wanting to do more to be able to help families.
Thank you. And Leah, you're working at the community level. So curious what you're seeing in terms of what keeps you up at night in terms of the current state of the state.
Sure. Well, good morning, and thanks for having me. Glad to be here with you all. Whew, that's a question there. There are lots of things that keep me up at night. I just will say to you that the National Black Child Development Institute is a 52-year-old national organization that has an affiliate network of about 24 community partners across the country. And so what I will share will often be a reflection of information, knowledge that we've received directly from our affiliates, as well as just my own personal experience as a Black mother raising a 9-year-old boy in the United States of America. So what keeps me up at night, I say that to also say I'm always dancing between what keeps me up at night when I think about all Black children. And our work is specifically focused on the unique needs and assets of Black children. And then I'm also thinking about my own son, which I know probably resonates for probably everyone in this group, whether it's a child you have or a child you know in both your professional and personal life, you're often thinking about both at the same time. But just specifically to the issues that keep me up, I think right now I'm really up at night thinking about gun violence in this country. And in particular, just how it almost makes me want to cry to say it out loud, but how quickly we just move on from incident to incident. And we as organizations find ourselves in situations where not only are we working directly with our affiliates, we have an affiliate in Hampton Roads, Virginia, which was very close to the horrific shooting with the 5-year-old student who shot his teacher. So we're working with them directly on how they're dealing with that sort of violence in their communities. And then we're also in this interesting place of you have these kind of like boilerplate statements already ready because we know what's going to happen again. And so that keeps me up at night, this idea that we are at a place in this country where just 2 weeks ago, right? Students are literally in harm in their classrooms, and we just kind of move on to the next thing as if that's normal. So I think a lot about parents and what it's like as a parent to not only be trying to get the basic needs. You're just trying to get food, clothing, shelter, bring your kids, some fun and excitement, have some joy. And at the same time, yes, I just let her do what she's doing. She is part of the panel. I love her. But you're also then in this deep fear of literally your child's life. And when they go to school, what's going to happen? And so that's something that keeps me up at night. We're thinking a lot about just the increases in stress and mental health and racial anxiety that are being reported with our young children, and not just teenagers, middle school students as young as elementary school, and even seeing some of it with 3 and 4-year-olds, that their behavior is showing high levels of stress and anxiety. So those are two that, there's many, many more, but those are two that I would name here that are really keeping me up at night.
Thank you. Christine, I'm curious what you're seeing at the state level, and particularly when you think about the governance work that you have in terms of the foster families and foster children in your.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you to both of you, because I think what you're saying keeps me up. I could answer that question in probably 100 different ways, depending upon the day, the month, the year, what's happening, nationally. But specifically within the state, I think the things that we're really focused on now, I worry about workforce. I worry about the health of our workforce, the workforce who's current, the fact that many of our mental health agencies, our provider agencies, are not able to hire staff because so many individuals are leaving the field. Like, I think there was a study, like 20 or 25% people just left providing any kind of social service. So, I don't know how we're going to get that back. I worry about that many of our staff also are our parents who live in our communities, who also suffered from COVID and, the effects of that. So workforce is an issue. I would also say inequities, like the inequities that exist within our child welfare system. Um, you know, I became the commissioner in New Jersey about 5 years ago. And one of the things at that time, we really started moving on prevention and this platform of really wanting to shift our system so that where we were spending so much money on intervention and deep end intervention and removal of children, that we really flipped that and started to invest more heavily in prevention. And we had been doing that in New Jersey for about 10 years. And so, we really made that commitment. If you look at our strategic plan, it's really focused on that. And one of the things we added was core approaches, or what we now call core approaches to our work, which beyond vision, values, mission, really looking at equity being centered, family voice being centered, protective factors are one of the core approaches, and collaborative safety, like that sense of psychological safety for our staff and families. And I think, we started down that path and are continuing that work. But we really, as a result of COVID, I think there was such an impact, and now things have shifted or are shifting. And so, I think what does keep me up is needing to continue on that path, and waking up every day with the opportunity to do something good or new, but knowing then the inequities also that exist in our system, that exist everywhere, and the impact of how, as a leader, I'm driving that change within my organization, but also listening to families and having an opportunity to really hear directly from people who have been impacted by the system. I think that's what kind of is shifting, where we see the inequities, and that's how we're going to be able to make the change that's necessary. But I would say primarily those are the things that, at least today, are keeping me up.
Thank you so much. And Commissioner?
Thank you, Katie. First, I just want you to know I was really up last night thinking about these things, so it's not even. What keeps me up at night is, everything that causes family separation, right? A lot of what my work is really around keeping families together, mostly with respect to foster care, but there are so many different ways that families are torn apart in this country. So you heard you talk about poverty and the definitions of neglect and what are the societal views around neglect that causes a family separation and children to come into foster care. I think about mass incarceration as family separation, and it's impacting our children. I think about young adults who are in foster care, who are also parents, who, depending on where they are in this country, are subject to a practice that would automatically bring their children into foster care. That to me is a travesty. I think about disaster equity, and I don't think we talk about that enough. I don't know how many of you have seen Katrina Babies. It's about the people, the young people, children of Katrina who are now adults, and how that disaster impacted them. It has lifelong effects. There's disasters happening in this country every day. There are floods and fires and tornadoes, and families are separated. Even our workforce is, when recently in Mississippi, I had to reach out. How are we doing? How are the families doing? How is the workforce doing? We're impacted. And the news cycle is really short. So we'll hear, if we're not in that area, we'll hear about it for maybe 2, maybe 3 days, and then we move on. But the truth is that children and families are impacted by these disasters, right, due to no fault of their own, often separated and having lasting impacts on their education, on their economics. So I want to really lift that up. And I know it's administration, we are really trying to hone in on how we can be supportive, and we're from a human resources perspective, human services perspective, where disasters are concerned. And then what we call ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. This is on my mind, right? This is, being questioned, right? Cultural connections, tribal sovereignty is being questioned. But we shouldn't have to abandon our cultural connections, our culture, to get the help that we need for our families. So that is present on my mind right now.
Thank you so much. I wanted to dig into this question a little bit more. And Leah, could you share a little bit about, based on what you spoke about in terms of gun violence and the stress and mental health, paint a picture of what this is looking like to the lives of everyday, in everyday lives?
Yeah. So what does it look like in everyday lives? I think the way I would answer that, it's hard for me to, there are lots of pictures, I'll say that. But I think that one of the issues that NBCDI focuses on is around expulsion and suspension of children in preschool. And what can happen is often the behavior is described as, or is characterized as, bad behavior. Kids are doing things that they're bad kids, right? So there's this part of it that looks like a 3 or a 4-year-old, for example, coming to school and maybe hitting another student or throwing something. I mean, it could be all sorts of behaviors. And that student, who is probably a student of color, most likely to be a boy, is then suspended. And if it happens multiple times, that child is expelled, right? The child is not directed to services or supports that would try to unpack and understand why the behavior is happening. So that's what we're working towards, and that's what we want to see happen, right? Is that instead of going right to a suspension, you're finding out that this child didn't sleep that night because perhaps they don't have shelter. You're finding out that this child is hungry. And we all know remember the Snickers commercials about being hangry? Like, it's okay if it's an adult that's hangry. But for a child to be hangry, that poor little child is now, and I don't say poor meaning poverty, but that child is now on a trajectory that could absolutely ruin the rest of their lives. That child may be children deal with stress, right? There was, I think it was in the report, Ioma Aruka, who's a wonderful friend of the organization and probably a friend of everyone, mentions in the report our need to understand how children deal with racism, how racism impacts children. And I think that's an important line, and important for us to just recognize that it's not just something that happens to adults. But if you think about it, children are actually experiencing it directly in their own lives, like racism bias in their own classroom that would cause a teacher to say you are a bad kid and send you down this trajectory, right? And then it's also this indirect experience of how it's impacting your family. A 3, a 4, or 5-year-old is also having to deal with, so they're dealing with racism in both of those ways. And so that's one example that when we talk with our affiliates, because that is an issue that many of them are focused on, that's a picture that I would draw of, like, really just seeing this little child's face and knowing that 1 or 2 misbehaviors could impact the rest of that child's life in a really traumatic and horrible way.
Thank you for sharing. And Christine, I know you've talked about the disproportionality and the impact and the racism that Leah just brought up. What are you seeing in New Jersey with respect to the work that you do?
Um, so just talking about inequities, there was a recent study between, I think it was Duke University and Rutgers University, looked at 20 of the most populous cities in the country with regard to protective services and the likelihood of a child being subject to an investigation. And what they found was that 1 in 3 children in those cities would be subject to an investigation, potentially. But that when we looked at Black and Brown children, it was anywhere from 40 to 70% could be subject to an investigation. And that is a fairly recent study. And I know you probably, many of you, have seen some of those same kinds of studies. But how that plays out on the ground is even when we look at reducing the number of children in foster care or putting more upstream prevention services, it's still a matter of what happens when a call comes into the hotline and there's an investigation or somebody goes out, and then like what's the result of that. And when I became commissioner, I engaged in a listening tour and had the opportunity to speak to probably upwards of 500 or 600 people who were impacted by our system. And one meeting in particular, we were sitting in a circle at one of our family success centers down in the southern part of New Jersey. And there was a woman sitting directly across the circle. Maybe there was probably 30 people there. And I was talking about, the reduction of kids in foster care, and that, at our high, we had about 13,000, just over 13,000 children in care back in 2003. And today, I'm proud to say we have just about 3,000, a little less than that. But, so that's been 20 years of work to really develop services, and we weren't there yet. Like at this time, we probably had still close to 7,000 kids in care. And so as I was talking and describing that and saying that we had this reduction, a woman across the circle said, "I don't believe you. Like, that's not true." And I said, "No, I promise you it's true. Like, I can show you the information, the data, where it comes from." So besides the fact that I'm government and you don't trust that, like, why, right? And what she said was, because everybody in my community, everybody I know has a child in foster care, either did or does or will, and that stuck with me because it really struck me. I think Marjorie, you said something about social capital, and that this person, this community didn't have a lot of social capital. They didn't have others that they could really lean on, or because that was everybody's experience. And I think it was really at that moment that I knew we really had to double down on prevention and looking at the inequities in the system, and really focusing on, digging deeper into what was happening in communities, and began to do work around, trying to think about creating the community conditions to really eliminate the need for foster care, or now we say non-kin foster care, and really trying to build strong families and not destroy or end families, basically, because we've ravaged so many communities across this country through the work of protecting children, and we're really not doing anyone, not the children and not their families, justice.
Thank you. And we are seeing the harm in the system, and also reform, and we're going to talk about what that reimagining looks like. But Asia, first, I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of the impact on everyday lives.
Yeah, can I build off of what you said? Because when you talk about whole communities where everyone has a child or has had a child in foster care, that's startling. But we talked about concrete supports. You heard Ju talk about the need for concrete supports for families. So we're seeing families have needs. They need housing. They need cash. They need food, right? The stomach. But that call, right? That one call, we're talking about racism, we're talking about bias. And so we know that there's racism and bias, and who makes the call and why, and who's subject to the call. But the one call, most people don't even realize how that impacts a parent, right? Their ability to get a job later on. You might make that call. You think maybe you're saving the family. Maybe you're mad at the family. You're making that call. And so it has a ripple effect and that I think a lot of people are unaware of. And so, so that one call, right? Let's say a call was made to my grandmother, because she was, let's say, for example, she didn't have the food that she needed, or let's say, her children, their clothes were dirty, and someone thought, oh, let me just call child protection on it. And so, if my grandmother's children come into foster care, it's more likely that my mother's children are now going to come into foster care, right? So we're talking about what we're talking about. You all know, right, that multi-generational sort of trauma. And so then that's how you also have communities of people where everybody has had some sort of impact on the system. Exactly why we need a 2-generational strategy, right? Because that's one way of impacting the multi-generational trauma that we're seeing in communities. So, and we see this all over the country, which is one reason why, young people in foster care, young adults having their own children, right? They are our parents now. It's concerning for me as to how we are supporting them and helping them and keeping their children away from foster care.
Thank you. The numbers that, Christine, you talked about in New Jersey are happening all across the country. I can give you California numbers. 25% of white children in California will be investigated for abuse and neglect by the time that they are age 18. 50% of African American and Native American children have that same investigation rate by 18. This is happening across the country. And so it's something that we all deeply are looking at and thinking about different ways of doing our work. And I'd like us to dream a little bit about what that looks like given the state of what we just talked about. There's a movement around the country to reimagine child welfare, to create a child and family well-being system. A lot of us are doing a great deal of work around what does it look like to go from mandated reporting, that call that Asia talked about, to community supporting. And so what I'd love for us to do is spend a little bit of time dreaming. What does that look like in wherever we sit? And then after we have that conversation, a little start of that conversation, we're going to open it up for questions from you. So please think about your questions. We'll do it from the audience and then do it online and then have a wrap-up question at the end. And so, Asia, I'm curious, so much is happening at the federal level throughout the country. What are you dreaming about?
First of all, I really love that question, so thank you for asking it. When I was developing my vision and I was appointed in March of 21, they were, what's your vision? What's your vision? And I thought about why I do this work when it gets really, really hard and I'm exhausted, why I do it. I do it for love. I do it for the love of the children and the families that I serve. And I put that word in my vision statement. Some of you may have seen it, and it was controversial, believe it or not. People are like, that's not a professional word. You can't have that in your vision statement. Anyways, love drives me to do the work, and it drives me to dream. I'm really excited about the this administration really putting forth so much effort in anti-poverty measures. The Family First Prevention Services Act actually is a vehicle that hopefully will move this country in the direction of federal reimbursement for prevention services. And we need to move way more, but we have to start somewhere. So we're trying to do that, and that I dream about that, and I dream about how that might shift the conversation, but also how we impact families. I'm excited also about organizations like We Got Us Now, who are just helping to support whose parents have been incarcerated. Because there are a lot of children who are impacted by foster care and impacted by incarceration. And I'm also dreaming about the interagency connections and partnerships that we have. I have a strong partnership with HUD, I'm happy to say, strong partnerships with our Department of Education. We are working more closely, I think, with CMS, Medicaid than ever before. Because honestly, child welfare should be the absolute last stop. And so we know we have to be working with our partners in government if we're going to support families without having that separation be anywhere near necessary. So thank you for asking.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I think some of us sort of think child welfare is the first, sometimes becomes the first stop. It answers all problems. And I love that you talked about just what that interweaving looks like. Christine, love to get your thoughts in on this.
So I think about really eliminating the need for non-kin foster care. That, we know, being in this work, that there are some children who are not safe at home. And so, they do need to come into care for a brief of time as possible while we work with their parents to really get them whole and healing so that they can, take care of their children. But how do we continue to work to support kin and support family to be able to step in so that we're not adding that additional layer of harm on children who are already hurting or injured and, and being removed from their families. So I do think a lot of the work that we're driving toward in New Jersey is as a result, like to get those results. But one of the things I'm happy to say is this budget that will be coming out in July, we have probably about $120 million new state dollars coming into our budget. Half of that is for prevention services. And that, I think, is a big success and something that we've been building on for decades in New Jersey, but really in this administration, doubling down on that. And some of that prevention is for to support children, in home with their families. But because it's primary prevention, it's eliminating that a family may end up being a call to the hotline. Like that's, I think, what I'm really I get most excited about and most energized about is that there are opportunities that exist, and there are all of you here and those watching. Everybody's really focused, I think, on that same goal of building strong families, building strong communities. How do we support that, through the 2-gen approach, like to eliminate intergenerational, involvement in the system, but that there's a lot of opportunities that exist currently. And the fact that we're having these conversations, the fact that we're talking about the inequities in our system and that we're talking about poverty and the impact of poverty on families, I think is really the right step or the right next step to really be able to make a difference and see a reimagined child welfare system in the next, hopefully, 10 years.
Thank you. Randall, what are you dreaming about with respect to this work?
What I'm dreaming about is really system accountability in terms of really developing approaches that benefit families. I think that there's too many systematic, whether it be departments or agencies that are in place for families in the event that they don't do something. I don't think that there's enough in place for families so they don't get into that situation where they feel pressured or that they don't have the option to be able to sort of say move forward in life. I live here in Washington, D.C. We are home to so much government, so much federal agencies, so much dollars. We've listened so much. I think that we have to lift community voice up to the highest decibel that we can and be able to utilize what these communities are saying so that governments can go back and actually put safeguards in place that benefit families. But it has to be done with intentionality. It can't be done sparingly. It can't be done in pockets. It has to be equitable access, an approach for all families. It should include full inclusion. Families should not have to feel they have to separate or don't have opportunities as a result of their income status, their marital status, or maybe their relationship status. So just very wise systematic accountability and understanding that we've listened, we've learned, and we know so much about what has not took place. So now we have to put those action steps in place for the things that are going to work for families so that families can live better, support one another better, and be able to remain with each other.
I remember we had a conversation a couple months ago now, and you said people are talking, but no one's listening. And that was super powerful for me. I'm curious, when you talk about the system needs accountability, if it got there, what would it look like to you?
What it would look like for me is repurposing dollars from different agencies that have traditionally not supported the full growth or well-being of families to more departments to enrich capabilities for families. Even from a benefit standpoint, if it's a matter of increasing benefits for families, increasing access to opportunities for families, families need more. Here in the district, we have a very, very sort of say, it's scary how real the disparity between minimum wage and living wage is. Like it's very, very much real. And so we have to take an accountability that families need help, need support. Families are not being met where they dream. Families aren't even being met where they are. Families are being met by their circumstances and by what they're going through. So what it would look like for me is to have a better inclusionary focus on success for families and what steps we need to take to get families there.
Thank you so much. That resonated with a lot of us. Leah, what about you? What are you thinking
Everything Randall said. What I will say, and I in all seriousness, do ditto everything that my colleagues have said. I think for me, it's like the heart of the matter is how do we see each other and what's the value we place on human life? And so, I often think about how do we shift from problems and fixing people and really shift to leaning into the possibilities of each other. And so if we shift it in that way, you can see this shift from you could see a shift from child welfare to well-being because you're seeing people in a very different light. It's not about, oh, you've got all these issues and problems, and so we've got to fix you. And one of the fixes may be separating you and your children. But it's really looking at people in a different light and saying, but, with everything you have going on, and I think about this a lot with, in particular, Black and Brown people, it always interests me when folks want to talk about helping people build their resiliency. And I'm like, okay, but do you understand that there's resiliency is the reason so many of us, generation after generation, are still here. And with all the challenges and struggles, can be laughing and joyful and just trying to do their best, right? And so how do we, as people with influence and power in the various ways we have it, how do we shift our minds to see people in that light, to see people for the possibilities, to instead of saying, how do we build your resiliency, actually ask, how have you even gotten to this point in your life? What can we learn about what you are doing every day, where you wake up, you make it happen? That's resiliency on a daily basis. And so how do we really lean into the strengths, the assets, I say the brilliance and sheer genius of people who wake up every day and somehow make it happen? The systems are completely, we all know, unfair and complicated for very purposeful reasons. And there are people who still somehow get it done, and we have so much to learn from them. And so I envision the tables, right, being set, not just inviting these folks to the tables, but these folks being resourced to set the tables and really have the conversation centered and directed by folks that are really living these experiences on a daily basis.
Thank you so much for bringing the dignity of humanity here. And Randall, you talked about income. And so there's one dream I just wanted to add, because and then we'll open it up to questions. A data point that's been really impacting me is the fact that if you increase, and this is research that Chapin Hall has put forward and brought together, if you increase minimum wage by $1, you get a 10% decrease in neglect cases countrywide. And there's more of that sort of economic data around what happens when you increase concrete supports, economic benefits. You see dramatic decreases in neglect. And the converse is true. When you limit economic supports, you see an increase of neglect cases. And there are amazing organizations that many of us are with, family strengthening, family supportive organizations that help families and connect with families. So thank you very much for dreaming with us. I wanted to open it up for questions, and then we'll have our final comments about what's our call to action for everyone. I see a hand over here, and I know that we're going to go over here in a second.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone. Super exciting to hear about the innovation that's happening in thinking about offering supports and services to families in a primary preventative way, as opposed to focusing so much on secondary and tertiary. My question is, in designing those programs and policies, we often think about the mechanics of it. What resources, what supports, what services can be offered? And we spend relatively less time thinking about the affective or qualitative dimensions of how they're delivered. So who's going to be giving these services? What are the administrative burdens associated with getting access to a resource? How are people being treated? Like what kind of dignity and respect comes along with it, or lack thereof? So very curious to hear from any of you about who's thinking about that. What are you working on to make sure that the stuff that's on offer actually works for families from a user experience perspective?
Christine and Asia, you may have
You want
comments.
to talk?
I can say something.
So thank you for the question. There's not a one size fits all when it comes to any service. And, thinking about some of the prevention services that we currently have and then those that we're building, we do have a network of family success centers, 57 throughout the state. And those programs are driven by the end user. So, the individuals who live in the community, who go to the center, they're the ones who develop the curriculum or develop, what services are available or what will be offered there. And we're looking to move to do that, I think, even more intentionally upcoming, in that we're going to be training our Family Success Center staff and directors and hopefully parents in a model of like design that they actually will be able to work with, larger groups of people from those communities. But the center staff will facilitate those sessions so that they'll be hearing directly from many voices about what's needed and, what the offerings will be. But I think it also goes to like our, when we have new dollars or we are looking to create new programs, that those programs are designed with people who have been impacted by the system or who will be the recipient of the service. And we now have, in the design of those programs, people with lived experience participating in the development. They're the ones who are telling us the types of programs that are needed or what they're looking for, both our young people and then also parents. And then they also participate in the reviewing of the proposals. And so their voice is a part of which agency will be awarded those, programs. And so I think that's another way of ensuring that the people who will be impacted or who will benefit from those services really have a say right from the start in not only what programs are available, but how they're designed and who ends up, running them.
Thank you so much. And Asia, did you?
Just quickly, I was going to mention our national roundtables that we did last summer. We had a national roundtables around the Black experience and accessing ACF programs. We asked people across the country, what is your experience like? Particularly, did you experience any racism, discrimination? How can we do better? What would ongoing communication look like for you? And so we just asked, what about their experience and our delivery of programs.
Thank you so much. I know there's a question over here.
We have one from virtual question, actually, and then we'll get to that question.
That's awesome.
This comes from Jessica Kirchner, who asks, how can agencies and institutions adopt trauma-informed practices to support parents and also build awareness on prevention of and the long-term impact of adverse child experiences?
That's a great question.
I'll take a stab at it. So hopefully I can remember the question. So one of the things that I think is really important and goes to the transformation of our systems is being able to understand adverse childhood experiences. But we're really also focusing now on positive childhood experiences and how do we build those in. It gets to the resiliency also, like how do you start building those, resiliency at an early age. But the thinking about, in New Jersey, we have an Office of Resilience and we have an Office of Staff Health and Wellness. And so we look at it as kind of the inside and the outside game. So the Office of Resilience is really focused on adverse and positive childhood experiences in our community agencies, in community with, anyone and everyone who about raising awareness. And then also being able to support kind of efforts toward becoming more trauma informed, whatever that looks like. And we're at the point of working to develop kind of a virtual technical assistance center to make resources available to, again, anyone who's interested, because that office has been focused on educators and law enforcement, and we need to get to all of our community agencies. We have a lot of individuals who will say they're trauma informed, or, and I think I've been studying ACEs and PACEs and, trying to dig into that for 6-10 years. I still would never say I'm fully trauma informed. Like, I think it's an evolution and we're constantly learning, and centering the voice of people with lived experience also, I think, gets to, how we or better support and think about, ACEs and how we mitigate those.
Thank you so much.
Drayton Jackson, Foundation for Homeless Poverty Management. In these spaces, it's a great conversation, but I never hear about the difficulties that Black parents go through with adopting Black children. In Washington State, and I'll just be very transparent with it, it's actually being used as a tool to show I'm not racist. And the barriers that come with good Black families that are economically well to have that has been very more challenging than white families that do that. Does anybody have any suggestions, or is there work being done to try to look at those numbers and decrease a lot of those Black children that are going to white families? They may be good and everything, but the cultural part of it is what is important for it.
Thank you for that question.
I mean, I think, it's challenging because I think, to your point, it's not something we talk about. And so I honestly can't point you to resources that I know of offhand. I mean, I think so much of it is about how we're thinking about cultural relevancy and expansion, and how we value or devalue. But I feel like I'm telling you what you know, right? Like the value, how we value or we don't value Black parenting styles is a lot of what happens here. And so I don't know, I wonder if in some of the like family centers or parent training that happens, if there's any focus, or how do we kind of build a focus around understanding diverse parenting styles and sort of matching, I hate to use that word, but matching children with the parenting style, right, and the cultural experience that would best work for them, as opposed to thinking in these lines of like good parent, bad parent, and good parent often looks like one kind of parent. But I honestly feel like I'm kind of just reflecting back to you, which you probably know.
I'll just say quickly, Multi-Ethnic Placement Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's too complicated in terms of the conversations that are happening around that now. But would be happy to connect with you offline and connect you with some people who are thinking about this on a very regular basis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to be able to give you the last word in terms of your closing thoughts, a call to action. Lots of people in the room with lots of networks and influence and innovation and thoughts. And Randall, I'll start with you.
I guess my call to action, when I think about it, is that we need to stop investing in what doesn't work for families. But it's something that's been going on for so many generations that we have to break a generational societal problem. I heard yesterday that the Aspen, is close to their 75-year anniversary. That's something to celebrate, be proud of, and embrace. But we're less than 10 years from the 100-year anniversary of the Great Depression. So when you think about that and how it impacted America, how it impacted families, the legislation, the barriers that they put in place as a result of that time, and how it still impacts people to this day, we have to take accountability. We have to look at what that is done to people, and we have to create change. We have to create intentionality around that change, or else we'll just spend the next 100 years really, so to say, rewriting all of our wrongs.
Thank you. Leah?
Sure. So I guess a call to action for me would be to continue to push on sort of peeling back the onion of policies, right? And not thinking about equity. We know that equity has become this buzzword, and it's, to really understand that equity is a process. It's not just something you kind of think about or do. It's actually not even the outcome. That I really appreciated you pushing us on vision. Like, that's not the vision. Justice, liberation, freedom should be the vision. That's the outcome. That's what we're seeking to achieve. Equity is the process that gets us there. And so we need to think in every policy you're working on, every program you're in designing, using a racial equity analysis and literally asking the questions: who has been involved in the design of this? Who's going to be impacted? Are there any unintentional consequences? Like, really, the exercise of asking those questions, not just sort of, saying we're doing equity without really putting forward the intentionality around the process.
Thank you. Christine?
I guess my call to everyone is to lead from whatever seat you're in, wherever you sit, whatever your position is, lead from that and be courageous. I think it's hard in this space. We talk a lot about what needs to change, but the only people who are going to make it happen are us, right? And so I would say it's really important to look at and think about what the change you want to see, and then be courageous in calling out those inequities and in taking a stand.
Thank you.
I get the last word?
Absolutely.
I have thought about this. In 1967, Adam Clayton Powell gave a speech called "What's in Your Hand?" At that time, he was talking about a vote, that people could vote, but he borrows from a biblical story, Moses being appointed to lead people, and Moses had anxiety, and God says to him, "What's in your hand?" He says, "A staff." Anyway, the staff goes on to work miracles. So my call to action is, what's in your hand, in your personal hand, in your organization? Where's your staff? And I'll tell you, I have a personal experience with that. I was unexpectedly had to take care of my grandnephew a few years ago, and all of a sudden I have a 2.5-year-old, and One of my neighbors showed up with some toys that her grandsons left at the house and didn't want anymore. And one of my neighbors just came to me and said, I see you have this child. I'm retired. I can babysit if you need. And, and so they were giving me what was in their hand. So in this work that we're doing, as we go about it every day, what's in your hand?
Thank you so much. Please join me in expressing gratitude to our incredible panel. Bring your hands together.